Good evening, everybody. I'm Gwyn MacDonald. I use she plus pronouns. I have light colored, straight-ish shoulder length hair. I'm wearing wire rimmed glasses, blue eyes, a blue sweater, and a blue shirt. Welcome to the second in a series of the League of Professional Theater Women's Working with Disability Professional Development Seminar. The professional development seminars are one of the many activities that the League does. And as a professional theater women organization, theater women identifying organization, the accent is really on profession. And one of the things that occurred to us as we were programming the seminar is how to expand our professional networks. And as we all know, we tend to get jobs by word of mouth and to reach out to people within our network. And sometimes that is confining. So disability is an issue that is sensitive in human existence. It is something that we all share the potential for, if not the actuality. And it is something that has been too marginalized. I shouldn't say too marginalized. It has been marginalized. It's like saying you're somewhat pregnant. Has been marginalized in theater. And since the pandemic, we've all noticed that there is a certain reshuffling of the hierarchy, and that has kind of defined the structure of theater. And within that, possibilities have opened up. And so we're going to be talking about what are the possibilities that disability, whether it's disability centered work in terms of plays or in terms of collaborators, what are the possibilities that that brings to theater, which is the medium of expressing human experience? And what are the possibilities for us who are disabled theater artists? And what are the possibilities for us as theater artists, disabled or not, to expand our networks to encompass the whole tableau, I don't know, whatever word works for you, tableau spectrum of human experience. So tonight, we have two very distinguished panelists with us, and I'm about to introduce, and I just want to say that Madeline Charney, a wonderful dramaturg, is, I don't know if it's due to weather, but we got just about 40 minutes ago, she's stuck in an Amtrak train. So I have been in that position, and I hope it is not for too much longer. But we'll miss her, and perhaps in part 3 of this series, the final part of the Working with Disability series, she'll join us. So I want to bring on both our panelists. Dr. Katja Vertis and Quinn O'Connor. So let's see, there's Quinn. Hello, Quinn. And Katja. Dr. Vertis. May we call you Katja this evening? Excellent. So it's interesting that among the two of you, there is a lot, of course, intersection. I mean, you both are extremely educated in both theater practice, theater pedagogy, and disability studies. And reading through your very distinguished bios, it's interesting to try to track the evolution and it's almost impossible because of the nature of a condensed bio. So I'd love to kind of untease that and first talk about the work. Quinn, you're a stage manager, you're a producer, you're an activist, and that's an issue that we'll touch on, activism, both as an interest and necessity. And you're currently in LA, and Dr. Katya Vertis, who we shall call Katya for the evening, also similarly 20 years of experience in many different disciplines, including lighting design and some fascinating, really fascinating ideas about lighting design. A fundamentally different way of conceiving it that I would like to touch on with you. So Quinn, do you want to give us a quick rundown? Maybe audio describe and tell us where you're coming in from right now, and we see you're in an office.
Yes. Really quickly. Hello, everyone. My name is Quinn O'Connor. I use she, they pronouns. I'm currently in an office with a bunch of wood shelving behind me and a snippet of a printer. I am a mixed race woman with black hair about shoulder length. I'm wearing over-the-ear headphones and a black leather jacket today. Do you want me to expand on anything, or is this just intros?
No, that's good.
Great.
And you're in LA, and is there a project? Yes. Is this a production office, or is this kind of your permanent office?
This I work in theatrical management, so this is kind of a
gotcha
office, but okay.
I'm
currently working as a stage manager with the LA Philharmonic on a Symphonies for Schools program. We're doing Swan Lake with the orchestra.
Yes. Oh God. All right. Well, that's interesting. Katya?
Hi, I am Dr. Katya Vertis. I am a middle-aged non-binary individual wearing a burnt orange shirt with a light gray over cardigan and long blue earrings. I am white and I have silvering, very short brown hair in a faux hawk with brown eyes and purple wire-rimmed glasses. I'm in my apartment, and behind me are various bits of art and books on shelves. And I am coming in from Forestville, Maryland, in Prince George's County, outside DC, and on the traditional homelands of the Nacotchtank or Anacostan people. And I use they, them pronouns.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And I neglected to say I have a very eclectic, very busy background that I try to block out. So let's talk with what came first. Interest in disability aesthetics or interest in theater? Was it a parallel? How did you both get into what launched your intellectual and professional pursuits? Start with you, Quinn.
I would say definitely theater. My parents both worked in theater broadly. My dad was more on the management side. My mom was an actress and singer. So I was always around theater. I grew up with theater. I will say, though, that and it's related to my disability because in middle school, when you're doing all the sports, all the very active things, theater was the one thing that I could really do. And it was, I like to say that theater's full of a lot of misfits in certain ways, especially when you're in that younger adolescent phase. So that's what I was drawn to specifically because I couldn't, reach a certain level in gymnastics, or I couldn't go, more professional or more, varsity sports and things like that, because there were a lot of blockades and a lot of, I think, strict boundaries when it came to, I have a physical disability, I have cerebral palsy. So that's something where theater created more of that leeway in a sense. There's obviously a lot of ableism present in theater, and we'll talk about that as well today. But yeah, it was something that at first, that was what really drew me into theater as a more professional path and a more more of a passion of mine rather than just listening to musical recordings in the car and going to theater with my parents and things like that.
Yeah. And at what point did you decide, not to go into academics, but to actually go into professional theater?
That was probably I applied to a lot of universities under the guise that I couldn't do a professional career in theater at that point in my life. And I saw stage management specifically as something that wasn't really attainable in a full-time sustainable sense. But I would say that the point that changed for me was when I was stage managing an opera at my high school. And that was something where even like during that time, my high school was not accessible to me. I had to really kind of fight for getting to the booth and the catwalk and how to call a show if I'm not really able to safely climb a ladder in my public high school, because they weren't ADA compliant. But I think that experience, and also I'm a very musical person. I grew up playing music and singing and things like that. So I think that was a time when I realized, oh, I actually do want to do this professionally. And now I'm going to go to the college that has the best path for me to do that without getting a BFA at that point, because I hadn't applied to those programs. But I would say definitely at that point, because I think at the heart of it, it's really the artistic practice of theater and the experience that we all can kind of share in one space is what really drew me. And I think drew a lot of us to that point.
Yeah. I want to highlight some things that came up before. Katya, I want you to kind of bring in your own narrative that relates to this stage. I want to just put on the side, because I want us to come back to this topic. The obstacles that you faced, were they real or in a way manufactured by the structure of theater as it was at the time? Which is maybe a little obtuse sounding, but we'll explore that topic. Just in plain English, could things have been easier had theater been less hierarchical and rigid and a little bit more fluid and perhaps elastic and expansive and creative? Let's just say creative, right? Creative solutions as opposed to the way it's always, doing things the way it's always done. So Katya, as you were listening to Quinn, tell us a little bit about you at that stage, and also, was there anything that she said that you recognize as being the same or different?
Sure. I also started theater in high school. I was disabled since birth, or pre-birth. I have a genetic disorder. I was put together wrong. But my condition, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, wasn't diagnosed until I was 28, which is very common in my disease community. And part of that is because while the condition has affected me my entire life, when I got into my late 20s, I went from being basically able to fake not having disability and exist in the ableist world without accommodations. It was hard in many ways, but and in retrospect, I needed accommodations and support and mobility devices and the like much earlier, but I didn't see from that perspective until after I became much more physically disabled and went through a 2-year process of becoming diagnosed before I was my experiences of my body failing me were validated by the medical community. And at that point, I was already through my PhD coursework and working on my dissertation. I had 4 surgeries in the course of doing my dissertation, which created its own challenges.
Wait, can you just tell us what your dissertation, like just the topic of
Sure. My dissertation title is Black or Red: The Construction of Identity in the Radical Plays of Langston Hughes.
Great.
And my work on this question of identity and how identity is constructed, especially within intersectional experience and the ways in which the war structure of our society pushes us to identify most strongly one way, or there's conflict between multiple identifications with how society is structured. That work ended up being the underpinning of my academic work on disability in theater, because it very much shaped how I think about identity and disability as an identity as opposed to a biomechanical experience, and how that relates to questions of art and how we tell stories of who we are through art. I certainly wanted to note that while I wouldn't be diagnosed for many years, like Quinn, I struggled with trying to work in theater spaces that are very challenging to get to. The booth is often not accessible, and the grid even less so. And so it became very difficult for me to climb into these odd spaces to carry physical equipment for lighting.
This was in your work as a lighting designer.
Yes. So this affected me from even when I was doing it as an undergrad. I started having, for example, real trouble walking across the campus when I was 19, though I wouldn't start using a cane for another decade. In retrospect, it was the internalized ableism of, oh, I shouldn't need one, but that's the history. And so climbing ladders and getting into these spaces was a challenge, even when I was young and healthy, and when I was not viewed by the medical authority or by myself as disabled.
I want to stop you for a second. You know, one of the things that jumps out at me is how in our field I was talking about hierarchy, and it's not just a buzzword. You know, we come up through the ranks traditionally, conventionally, as assistants. I'm a director, and, you know, the first stop is being an assistant director. And that's often the person who does you know, text work and, you know, photocopying and, you know, things like that. But it's also the person that conventionally had been the one to, like, I was asked to do at one point, you know, go and feed the dog. You know, and when I was like, I'm gonna be pretty slow about it, you know, I didn't get the job after, you know, pretty much being offered it. And, you know, it's the same with a stage manager. So, and the same with a lighting designer, right? You are the assistant, and the assistant traditionally does the grunt work, and the grunt work is usually the physical labor. Was that a challenge to become an SM? You know, did you guys go up through the ranks of assistantship and internships and all that stuff on the way up the vertical hierarchy to being a stage manager and a production stage manager and then a producer and yeah, assistants?
Yeah, I would say yes, definitely working as an ASM and being on the deck, which was some of my first jobs. It was always an interesting thing, and I identified with something that Katya said earlier about being able to kind of fake being able-bodied in a way and like fitting because I'm not I don't I'm not a chair user, and I think that's a really big marker to the able-bodied community of like, oh, this person's disabled, this person might need accommodations. But unless you like see me walk across the stage and really pay attention, you can't, like, if you're not paying attention to my limp, you don't think I'm disabled. Or if you don't look at my right arm, you don't think I'm disabled at first glance. So that I was able to, it's a weird thing because I'm able to get into these doors. And because I check a lot of other boxes in the diversity ranks, I'm also able to get into doors that a lot of, people aren't really able to get into from a young age,
Yeah.
because of a post-COVID diversity thing, which can sometimes be performative, sometimes be a good thing. So I get into the door, and then it's not until then, or it's not until I actually reach a roadblock where then, and as an ASM, I've had to go up to the producer and basically out myself, or like, things like that, to get that accommodation, because they're not, I think now that I also work as a producer, that's something that I like to put into practice, is asking people, or like, I think it's getting a little bit more common in the workspace of asking if you have access needs, etc.
Let's
Definitely, yeah.
that's such an important point, Katya, before we go to you and also jump in on this. That, again, this is a professional development seminar. How do we develop ourselves? How do we grow as artists and professionals? And it's important for everyone to understand, abled or disabled, that there's no monolithic experience of disability, just as there's no, each lighting designer is going to light just a little bit differently. So, but what's fascinating about what you just said to me, Quinn, is you're now in the position of being producer. So some of the conundrums, and I can't think of a better word, that you kind of brought to a producer's attention, like, this is my situation, I'm going to need accommodation. You now have to, as a producer, and you're expanding your network to people of all stripes. It sounds like your first piece of maybe guidance is to ask people about access needs. Yeah, as a producer.
To go into the hierarchy of theater and everything, like, it is the producer at contract signing, at the interview process. It is that, and I've been in experiences when I've stage managed for a dance company where that producer and that production manager took that step on our first phone interview, asking, and like and then also gave me a tour of the space. That's also something really important, I think, that you can implement as a producer or a production manager, is during the interview process, maybe during the second interview, having a site visit if possible, to have that, if you're hiring a disabled person or interested in hiring a disabled person, having them actually traverse the space, and giving them that space.
There's some fine lines there, right? You can't not offer somebody a job based on,
yes, right?
So do you want to talk about hiring and the thorny issue of access needs versus saying, are you disabled? I mean,
I think, you can't outright ask that, obviously. I think, though, across the board, opening up the space, and then if they, like, in an interview process, I usually do out I mentioned that I am disabled, and also, if you look me up online, you'll see that I'm disabled, because of the work that I do. So in my case, it's a little less of that, but that's a really good point. And I think I've had those space tours and given those space tours, with the intention as a producer to see what I can do to make that space accessible, or like how I can modify if needed, etc. Yeah.
I want to jump in right there because I think Quinn, and underline what Quinn just said, because I think there's a real thing about perspective. If you're hiring and you bring somebody into the space to see if they can operate within it as it exists, and if they need accommodations, that is used as an excuse not to hire, not only is that a violation of the law, it's also a terrible thing to do. Whereas if you take somebody into the space and see how they move and work within it, to find out what accommodations need to be put in place on what timeline, so they can do their job. That is a really important and meaningfully different approach.
Yeah.
And it's often easy to tell which is happening, even when those who are hiring try to pretend they're doing the second when they're really doing the first, because a lot of it comes down to people with disabilities are not the problem. And yet our culture places the problem on the person with a disability existing and wanting to work and moving within space. And so it becomes this framing of, oh, you're demanding extra things, special accommodations, you're asking too much, it's too expensive, how dare you inconvenience us. But when you instead flip and say the problem is structural ableism, and how do we make sure that the existing building structure, expectations of career path are excluding people, and how can we change them? That is the correct approach. And the difference can sometimes be quite subtle, but I think the same action can be either. It really comes down to what is the thought process and the goal, and where is the team positioning the problem to be fixed.
Yeah.
Because sorry, we're if we're fixing the existing problems so that disabled theater artists can do their best work, that's great. If it's removing the problem of disabled people trying to work from the community, that's bad.
Yeah.
And I also just wanted to highlight, again, with this question, going back to the question of assisting and coming up through the ranks, designing, it is very common that not only are you expected to assist, which is, in my experience, assisting has been really positive because the focus is more on the design work. And I use a wheelchair part-time. I always use at least one cane. And so my artistry is perfectly functional. It's the climbing ladders and throwing lights around that I have problems with. But it is really common in the design world that there's this expectation that you'll come up through the shops, that if you want to be a lighting designer, you need to be an electrician and a master electrician before you can make the jump to assistant lighting designer. That if you want to be a costume designer, you have to put your hours in sewing costumes. And I even remember in my design classes, a huge deal was made of the fact that to credit my design professors, their point was that it isn't necessary to do that, but that the idea that William Ivy Long is an exception in the field and a weirdo because he is an award-winning costume designer that infamously cannot set a sleeve correctly. So there is a path, and not demanding assistant designers and then later designers also be technicians is part of how the field needs to adjust to fight the ableism in the field as we bring it, and the expectations of hierarchy fusing design work with technical work, because there are a range of physical disabilities that mean technical work is not a good profession, but that doesn't say anything about your design ability.
Right. Yeah, I mean, decoupling technical from design artistry is something that is not only more and more possible as technology helps us, but it's in many ways it's been the convention and it's been our mindset, but it's not a hard and fast reality by any stretch. And if you look at photography, right? When digital photography, all the top photographers now use digital cameras. They're not setting the aperture. They're not, I mean, necessarily, but they also, generally speaking, are not developing, they're not in a darkroom anymore. They're sitting at a computer So to photo edit. I want to just say something about a point that was made earlier about intention with accessibility, when you're hiring a collaborator. And in my last project as a director, I became acutely conscious of the fact that if so much of our theater, generally speaking, is dealing with important issues about human beings, about society. There's a lot of uh, dramatic work these days that is addressing social inequity and again, very important themes. And to not have our process, our rehearsal rooms, our collaborative teams reflect social justice, reflect um, accessibility without obstacle, um, you know, unimpeded, inequality of access, in other words. Why are we doing work that is meaningful if our process is really cutting out the values that we are promoting in the plays we're doing? Long-winded way of saying that, but I think it is so important, not just from a social justice point of view, but from an artistic point of view. Something has got to get lost in the translation if our process is not reflecting the values of the work we're putting on stage.
So,
yeah.
Well-intended work done about people who aren't in the room almost always goes wrong. This is not to say that those in minoritized populations of various categories should be hired as tokens when the subject is about somebody who shares their embodied experience. But obviously that is not the case. But especially with disability, there is this perception that you don't need a disabled expert to do art about characters with disabilities, especially in some, like, how many shows in the canon disability is sort of detached, like Richard being conceptualized as disabled is not something that is often the case. And so, yeah, tokenization is not enough, but it is important to remember that even the best meant and most well-researched attempt to tell a story about the people who aren't included is pretty much certain to get some major things wrong.
Yeah, that's another aspect of it for sure. Yeah, Quinn.
And I think when you are hiring somebody, especially from the dramaturgical lens, because I think I've been on projects where people of that identity group or me as a disabled person have been asked to be the dramaturg where I'm actually stage managing, or and it's something to, again, from like a producerial point of view. If people don't have this is speaking on a very general scale, but accessibility is not budgeted into fiscal year budgets, and finding that money for a dramaturg and paying somebody for dramaturgical work is incredibly important when you're producing these things. And I think when it comes to access, intentionality is at the root of it. And when you're producing work, and it's the same for all identity groups, when you're producing work from that community or of that community, being intentional from the budgeting to hiring to production process is incredibly important. Because I've been a part of projects where the dramaturgs are me or are the other,
Right.
or the assistant sound designer who happens to also be disabled, or it's
Right.
just things like that where, yeah.
It's the extra work that
Mhm.
you're being asked to do
without pay.
and
Yeah.
without pay. And uh let's talk let's talk a little bit about, I want to go back to lighting design, but just because I love that topic. But before we do, this seems like a good segue in terms of activism. Um, can you, both of you are disability activists, yeah? Is that as correct? Okay. How did that happen? Was that a
Baseline.
choice? Was that a path? Was that yeah?
So, I mean, when I became more disabled, recognized as disabled, when I started, I now use a chair less than I did, but I went from conceptualizing myself as entirely abled to using a wheelchair almost full time.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a wake-up call, because privilege blinders mean that we don't see what we don't see. And not moving through the world on wheels, even if you're somebody who takes it very seriously and tries to pay attention to this topic, there's just no experience like it. And that included hostility from my department, from my coworkers, my the dean, one of the deans of my school, um, told me that they tried to discourage disabled students from even coming to their university because it's just too inconvenient to accommodate. And the disadvantage of not realizing I was disabled much younger is I didn't have the support I need. The plus side is that I didn't grow up hearing, "How dare you ask for extra stuff?" And so the idea that I would be told to my face, "We're just not going to give you what you're legally obligated to because it's expensive and inconvenient," was shocking and horrifying to me. And I immediately went, "Oh no, that's not how this is happening." And what started as survival quickly turned, especially as I got deeper into disability as an identity as opposed to debility as a body-mind experience. I've become quite involved with a number of disability rights groups, spent some time with Liberty in Philadelphia and doing some work with ADAPT. And so that really brought me into thinking about disability in a much broader way. And so I started making intentional choices in the work I was doing in service in the field and in activism and in mentoring and supporting students, our young professionals with disabilities. And so that led to me creating the role of the accessibility officer for the Mid-America Theater Conference,
Great.
because prior to that, there was nobody who was paying attention to the issue. Every disabled person had to negotiate for themselves every conference. And then also, I ended up co-founding with Bianca was forced out of the field because of her disabilities and need for health insurance, not being able to find work in the academic or professional theater world that supported that. But the two of us founded the Disability Theater and Performance Focus Group for the Association for Theater and Higher Education, and as we built that project, and that project is still ongoing and is expanding, we were both very interested in trying to build community and networks and supports so that those coming up in academic and professional theater with disabilities didn't go through that having to fight for everything because there was just nobody there fighting for them.
Yeah. Quinn, I'm thinking of all the producer training program. Well, all of them. You know, there's a couple of kind of famous producer training programs, right? Is anyone kind of training the next generation of producers about how to have accessibility in the budget, to understand if you cast a deaf actor, whether the role calls for a deaf actor or not, you're going to need a team, you know, usually two ASL interpreters, and you know, and the rate. All right, like, how do you think about budgeting for accessibility before casting is done, or do you think about budgeting for accessibility when you've identified that there'll be access needs on the project?
Yeah, I think in my experience in the couple producing programs that there are, and when I talk to people at that level, when it comes to one of my thesis project for my disability studies program in my undergraduate career was surveying theaters across the nation on their like just number of accessible shows or like ASL interpreted shows, just like basic things like that, just to get a sense of where accessibility was and where it showed up in their budget and in their programming. And I think overall, from those results, producing isn't, unless you have a very specific disability centric show in your season lineup, especially because the vast majority of regional theaters are nonprofits, and the way that budget is created, and also in a post-COVID inflation economic downturn world, it is like I'm working in these offices and it is incredibly hard to find that money on their end. So I would say a soft no on accessibility being talked about as a priority, unless you're at the higher budget level. Then you have the baseline of audience accessibility pretty much covered at this point. But I'm usually the one that is talking to people about how to, you know, bring access in. And I know that Yale's program I know the Yale School of Drama, which is obviously the tip top, you know, grad school program and not at all the, you know, the end all be all of grad programs in producing. I know that they have a disability working group that's built into their school, which is really great. But otherwise, not too much that I know off the top of my head where producers are learning about this, unless you are specifically connected to disability and have that on your radar.
So again, I may have missed it. One moment, Katya. So as a producer, what's your orientation? Are you thinking about accessibility? I mean, there's projecting a budget, and then there's the reality of funding. But when you project a budget or draft a budget, do you think about accessibility, or do you wait till there's a need for it?
At the theaters that I currently produce for, we're at kind of the more low to mid size budget. There isn't room for that, and unfortunately, and I don't have the power over a lot of the development and grant funding at this point. But in an ideal world, yes, that is when you would want to build it in. And I think a lot of theaters, and I think the general attitude around disability when it comes to audience access is, if somebody requests it, and if the disabled person puts it upon themselves to contact the box office and, you know, requests, and even at theaters that I've worked at with higher budgets, if like they do end up providing that, because, or otherwise they would be subject to breaking the law.
Right. But
they only have that one show, and then they have to provide it if there's a person that takes it upon themselves to ask for an ASL interpreter at a performance that wasn't the quote access
But
performance.
not just for audience, also for
Backstage.
talent backstage. Yeah. I'm gonna take myself off of video for 1 second.
Okay.
But Katya, what were you going to say?
I had two things. The first is pretty short, but I think it's just good information for everyone, especially in the nonprofit theater world. There is money from the states and the counties and the cities and the federal government for disability access.
Mhm.
And this isn't in our usual budget is kind of a terrible excuse, because planning ahead and applying to those grants can open up possibilities that the basic theater funding mechanism doesn't think about.
Mhm.
And then the other thing, and I think this ties directly to it, is Gwen flagged. There is a very strong attitude in the theater world that disability exists in the audience. And a moment when accessibility starts is when the audience enters the building, and that it doesn't happen on the stage or backstage or in the rehearsal hall or in the shops. And that's a major problem, because you can have fantastic access for the audience, but that doesn't help theater workers with disabilities, because if they're, I mean, sometimes they're in the audience to watch other shows, but for the jobs, there's no access, and there's no conception that people with disabilities exist in the theater to be hired. And even more than that, there is, as often happens with minoritized identities, even to the degree that we're recognized, there's this strong conviction that it's a token or pity or diversity hire. The idea that the best artist for a job might have a disability and needs to be accommodated is just not on the radar within how the field is structured and conceptualized generally. And that is a huge change of perspective that needs to happen, because like I said, things like grants, there are ways to handle the practical, but when there is no effort to go looking for people and include people with disabilities, then and there's no, let's get a grant and actually do this, that just doesn't occur, then it's just got to keep not happening, and people with disabilities are going to keep being shut out of the field.
Yeah. Quinn?
Yeah, that's I want to add on to what Katya said about I like to use this example of the Hades, because Hadestown is a very popular musical right now, the Hadestown set design. And like disabled actors in particular, or disabled people on stage, are automatically kind of shut out of even being cast in the role of Hades, of Persephone, of anybody that ends up, or a physically disabled actor specifically, anybody who ends up going up that spiral staircase. And the way that rehearsals and put in rehearsals, especially on a big commercial scale like Hadestown is, are even constructed, makes it that much harder for casting directors and for the associate director, for the stage manager, to even open up a conversation about having Hades be a physically disabled person, because then you have to reach out to the set designer, who has already gone on to years of projects after the fact, where even just that, the specific, when you're teaching design in a, if you're in a BFA program teaching design, or taking design classes, you're never taught really about access and ADA requirements, or even from a creative lens, how do I create access within my set while not taking away creativity. I think that the ADA is so, and accessibility in general is so masked by a lot of legalese, and a lot of like, that's what people present it as, where you can't, like, where it's hard to even start learning about how to create access from a creative lens, and creating a set, or creating a design, or creating costumes that can be easily adapted to somebody who's taking over that role. in a show.
And that's where back to what I said as in the intro, that's where possibilities, that's where disability thinking, inclusivity opens up possibilities for everybody. Set designers have always had to adapt their sets if it goes on tour to the various theaters, and it's a transferable skill, and how much more interesting is it to be able to adapt the set to the variations in human physicality. So I want to open this up to the audience. But is there anything that, Katya, you mentioned funding, and I imagine this might be a question, so I'll just throw it out now. Where someone wants to go look for funding, I mean, that's always this. But do you know, other than what we always go through looking for funding, are there places that you, just off the top of your head, know are dealing with accessibility?
Two big ones. One,
Okay.
like I said, governments, local, state, fed. We don't think of going outside of arts funding very often in the theater world, except maybe if you're doing an in-school program, you look for an education grant. But there are grants targeting access, and it is not against the rules to use those in a theater. It's just a different stream, and if you have a grants person, they can go dig in. They exist everywhere. It's not a ton of money, but even a little bit of money to convert a set so that you can pay to put the ramp installed where the set of stairs was, or to get ramps put in off stage so there isn't a situation like at the Tonys where blanking on her name, I can picture her face.
Ali Stroker.
Ali Stroker.
Yes, of course, Ali Stroker was stuck sitting off stage because she couldn't get onto the stage from the audience. Like, just build a ramp. It's not really advanced technology. But yeah, that money exists. It's a different stream. So it means going after it proactively. And then the other group beyond government that is hugely doing disability work and gives money for disability access programming. And at least there is the possibility of getting money for doing disability targeted work in a theater. Ford Foundation. They do a ton of work around disability, and they have a lot of money.
And I think too, when it comes to this expanding your avenues of grant funding also, and if you have greater audience accessibility, it expands your audience. And I know that in the event description, it says that, disabled, and the whole 1 in 4 stat and things like, disabled people, there are a lot of disabled people that exist, and there are a lot of disabled people that are shut out from even attending theater. And I think especially with disabled youth, I think when you're a kid and you watch theater, that's such a magical point in your life in a lot of ways, that if a disabled kid is able to access a show and access a performance, that means that person might become a disabled performer or a disabled theater worker, or expand, and then that just expands all of those possibilities. So having these access points will also will help you financially in other ways, in ticket sales and things like that, and expanding your audience, which is what a lot of nonprofit theaters are trying to figure out how to do right now in this day and age.
Especially now. Okay, great. Want to open this up for questions. You can ask a question in the chat, or you can come on camera as Judy just did. And Judy, if you could do a audio description of yourself and as you introduce yourself. And by
Okay.
the way, I have to apologize. My dog is in the background, and uh, I did give him dinner before, but he's older and I think he forgot. So if you hear some yips, he'll get his dinner in about 20 minutes.
Hi, just to let you know, first that the reactions for the only thing it says for hand raises is to recognize hand gestures and or to recognize a hand raise, put a chime in to enter to make a hand raise. It doesn't have you
Well,
have.
you gave us your hand, so we'll take that. So do you want to
Okay.
state your name and describe
Sure. Okay, Judy Binus. I am old and I have dark hair. I'm wearing a maroon sweater. I'm in my apartment. You can see part of a lamp in the background. And I'm wearing rimless glasses. And I have a beige wall. And that's kind of it.
Great.
Okay. Uh, I will say first that I have a ton of questions because I spent my career as a lighting designer and and a stage manager. So there are quite a few things. The first, and I'll just say this, when you're talking about the sit down, tours and you adapt for the theaters, when you're doing a sit down these days, I mean, I think since Phantom, I guess, or Cats, they would have weeks and weeks and months of load in. And like if it goes to Los Angeles, for example, and it's sitting down for months, they do the show. They don't adapt. It's just they do the design, they load in for months or whatever it takes, and then they run the show for 6 months, a year, whatever. So I'm wondering, as far as like a stage manager, I know I've done assistant stage managing, and there are times when I've had to run from one side of the stage to the other, or go run across and go upstairs and down, or down through the basement because there's no crossover on stage, and up to the other side. If I'm interviewing for someone for an assistant stage manager job, I want to get the best person. And I want to know, but if there are certain things that are standing, a block, as you say, I want to know that before I offer you the job, even if I want to offer you the job, because I know there are certain things. If you can't, for example, Quinn, I read some of your bio, and I know that you say you can't move quickly. Um, uh, so and you're open when you go in for an interview, you say that you have these things. So, but what happens if somebody doesn't say that, come in to the interview, maybe they have the same kind of thing with a limp that's slight, you don't really notice it. And I say, oh, this person's great. And then we say, we're going to hire you. And then I find out that they can't run if they need to run.
Okay. Judy, I'm going to stop you for 1 second.
Okay.
One of the most valuable things I learned in my last project, and it was funded by the group that came out of Oregon Shakespeare Festival, is that we have lived with a mindset in theater of both scarcity and, that everything you have to run. It's like.
So that's not what I mean. I don't mean
Okay.
that you always have to run. If
Okay.
there's something, if there are quick cues, let's say, and
Okay.
you're doing something on stage right, and then you've got to get over to stage left to do something with an actor. And
Gotcha.
that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So that I don't, yeah, gotcha.
Well, Quinn, just because I know, Katya, you raised your hand, but Quinn, would that be an insurmountable obstacle? How would that problem be solved creatively, or is it just impossible? Is there a creative solution?
I've worked So I'll give you two things. I've worked on a production where I was in ASM, and in the first 2 weeks of rehearsal and like in the first week of blocking specifically in a lot of production processes, you kind of know what you need to do backstage broadly, right? And I've been in a production where I was in a similar situation where I noticed, and I think too, it isn't necessarily just, I think there are instances where if you are the only person backstage, there might be a disabled or not, there might be something that, initially you might need to also be across the other. So like disabled or not, there's certain things in theater where at first glance, at first, pass it blocking, the director or the designer, et cetera, might not have taken that into account that there's one person backstage. So I think that this, even if somebody is disabled, et cetera, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a creative solution to it. I've also worked on productions where I've noticed that at the beginning, and knowing my abilities, and also knowing as an ASM, I think when I work in ASM roles, I bring a lot of care and thoughts of access when it comes to accessibility, whether the actor is disabled or not, and having that type of mindset is something that a disabled ASM can add to that role, right? And not necessarily just be a hindrance, or the fact that I can't run around backstage that much. Where I've brought to producers that I would need a run through. And this was in a really small, less than $1 million a year nonprofit. And those producers were really great and able to find somebody that could do some of the scene shifts while I was holding, a pieces of clothing for a quick change, right? So there's always that. And I think in the ASM role, you're able to flag that. And it's, it shouldn't be on the ASM specifically to flag those things and flag those points of access, et cetera, in a production. But I think those are ways that I've creatively come across that as an ASM. And then something that I would, again, I don't think this is a specific to disability issue either, because I think in any production, there's going to be those like weird things where people aren't octopuses with a bunch of hands and can do all of the changes that need to happen. And that's just a discussion in a production meeting or in a rehearsal room that I think can be creatively solved.
I'm thinking in terms of like a Broadway show where everybody's a union, and you can't, a stagehand can't hold this, or you're holding the thing, you can't do
Yeah,
that.
but you know what, Judy? The unions are coming to terms with the fact that you can ask for a special accommodation when it's needed. So I actually just had to do that in my last workshop, where instead of being confined to working, having a 6-day work week, they allowed me to, because of working with some disabled performers, they allowed me to expand the amount of, not add more days, but add not confine it to a week. So I could do 12 days across a week, across 2.5 weeks.
Yeah,
Because some people, were dealing with things that required a couple days off.
right. I'm thinking about things like stage managing on Broadway. I know Quinn, have you interviewed, for example, for a Broadway show?
I've interviewed for off Broadway.
Right. And was it a play, a musical?
Play.
I'm sorry?
A play.
A play. What about a musical like Harry Potter, for example, or something big? Would you feel comfortable being a stage
interview
for that?
I would, not knowing the track, I would feel pretty confident in doing that, knowing that also on Broadway productions there's usually another ASM that exists too. But also I want to turn to Katya if you had anything to add.
Yes,
as
Katya,
well.
sorry.
I wanted to underline one point that I think was really important. I am not trying to pick on you, but I think that you did something that is important to flag. And that is, you set up the idea that the best person for the job can run. And that by definition, somebody who can't run, somebody whose accommodations would need to adapt around your assumption that the ASM will be able to run, by definition, will not be the best person for the job. And that is casual ableism built on the assumption that have a disability is to be flawed, and that by definition, the best person cannot be a disabled person, and that accommodation will never be the best answer.
That's,
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, that kind of, like, we're all conditioned into that. We're enculturated. It's the world we exist in. We're all taught that from the moment we breathe in the culture. But when that baseline assumption goes unchallenged and that norm is treated as correct, then it is all but impossible to move forward and find the creative solutions because it's already been ruled out as the best answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
And wait, Judy, let me just say one thing. I want to underline and highlight and put in bold what you said. We are in a creative field.
Mhm.
As a director, as an ASM, as a producer, as an actor, we deal with obstacles with creativity. You know, it's creative solutions. That's what we trade in.
Well,
Wait, hold on a second, Judy. I'm going to move on from you, but we will continue this conversation.
I just want to say one
Yeah.
thing
Sure.
about to Cacho's comments. That's not what I'm saying. There are people that interview for any job or a stage manager job that don't get the job, whether they have a disability or not. You know, like 20 people can interview for a job and one's going to get the job. And if somebody is, their personality isn't right for that job. If it's a male PSM, might want a female assistant.
Judy, with love and affection and respect, I'm gonna stop you. But I think that you know, I do want to I want us to hear what Katya said, and because that is extremely important. We cannot be locked into really well-worn tracks that we've been on for, you know, centuries, decades and centuries. And we've got to start thinking creatively and really challenging our own assumptions. What are they based on? So, Judy, you and I will talk about this offline because we are almost at time, and I want to see if anyone else has questions.
I do, but I can't be seen.
Okay.
Oh, now I can.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks for coming back, Gabriella.
I had a good information to share
Okay.
because I'm friends with Sophia Kurak, and she's the senior human rights health advisor to the United Nations mission. And I know her for years, and she's amazing. She's in a wheelchair. She has a deformity, and she's their human rights and health advisor, foreign affairs, and I would love to share her information with someone so that to have some representative at the United Nations with disabilities.
Okay. So wait, is this a question?
No, this is what I'm off. I would like to share this.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do, and this is a very good segue, I'm going to ask you to send that information to Gabriella, because part of what's come out, and thank you, June, part of what is coming, has come out of this series, again, this is part 2 of a part 3 series, Working with Disability, is a resource library. And Gabriella, do you want to just say a few words about what's in the resource library? The link is now in the chat. Thank you, June.
You're welcome. So I'll send it to Gabriella. Yes.
That would be great. Thank you.
Great. So there's much more information about working with disability in theater that can be talked about in these seminars, and that can always be expanded upon. We have created a resource library to help expand and fill in the gaps. Right now, our resource library is broken into 3 major categories: accessibility and accommodations, the language of disability, and representation in productions. It also includes some material from the previous Working with Disabilities seminar. It is a living resource and will be added to and updated as we go forth with this program.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabriella. All right. Well, any other questions before we wrap this evening up? Did you guys, Lisa, you have a question?
I do actually, and I actually think it would be a nice wrap up. I would love to know your, sorry, let me just do a visual. I'm Lisa Dennett. I am a mixed race woman, brown hair, tied back, long glasses, black, white, and gray V-neck cotton shirt. My background is blurred. I would love if the 3 of you, Katya, Quinn, and Gwen, would your top 3 things that you think somebody who is clueless on hiring or working with someone in theater with disabilities, what would be your top 3 pieces of advice? I know what mine would be, but I would love to hear from you guys.
Who wants to? So, top 3 pieces of advice for wanting to expand your network to working with people with disabilities? Is that
if you're let's say a producer who's
right.
going to be producing a show and you're considering including somebody on your team with a disability, whether it's an actor, a director, a stage manager, designer, etc., but they have no experience whatsoever and are completely clueless.
Okay. Should I go first or should I go last? Who wants to go first?
I can start if
Please.
that's it. Number 1 off the bat, is the starting with starting from the perspective that the best person might have a disability, and that people with disabilities, because of our disabilities, have unique insights and ideas that can further the work. For just a quick example from me, I'm synesthetic. It is secondary to my disabilities, but because I experience sound and light and color together, it literally shapes how I design. And so we think of disability often in terms of debility, what is missing, what is wrong, but it can also add to. Yes, it requires going outside the standard way of doing things, but there is a way to do it. Apply creativity, and the money exists with apply creativity and plan ahead. And 3, if you've never hired with somebody with a disability before and you don't know where to start, the place where you start is hiring somebody with a disability. There is a point at which you're overthinking. Just hire somebody. Thank you so much for asking.
Great. Quinn?
Off the top of my head, I can offer 1 or 2, but one thing that I've come across a lot is taking out a lot of job descriptions will automatically be able to lift 25 pounds or more. And that's a big thing that's really just born into job descriptions across industries. And of course, one could argue, a technical director or a production manager or things like that. Like somebody might say, but they have to do that. But again, to Katya's point, they don't. like, I think that there's a lot of ways to work around that and a lot of very creative ways. And I think that that disabled person, if that person is hired, can offer a lot of those ways because they've more than likely experienced that and had to work around it already in their career. Taking that off of job descriptions, because I think as a disabled person, that deters me from applying to jobs, even though every single other point on that on that job description, I qualify and more for. Another thing, I think it's really important to have people go into your space and assess the space, not from a legal point of view, but also make sure that there's somebody with a disability justice or a disability studies background coming into your space, because I think it's one thing to have, an ADA consultant or a lawyer or somebody assess the space for legal access. And it's another thing to have a disabled person with a background in the work assess your space for accessibility, because the ADA and accessibility in my mind are two very different things. And creating a truly accessible space kind of entails that you bring somebody with that lived experience or with that background to go above and beyond the ADA. Because right now, I think even though places in LA, like the Geffen Playhouse especially, I've heard from people that live in LA that them as an audience member haven't been able to access the space, even though they do fully check all the boxes on the ADA and they are accessible on paper, but that actual audience experience still isn't quite accessible. So I think that those are two things that I could think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are all talking about the positives. I'm gonna rather than amplifying what you said, which I would love to do because it's so important. I would say something negative, which is, what do we lose when we don't include in our collaborative process? I'm a director. I want the best collaborative team I can get. And the best is usually, I haven't done the project yet, where a homogenous, collaborative, creative team was going to be the best. And if I don't want homogeneity, if I want diversity, you can't be selective. I mean, that's not diversity. So, I would say that we really lose out, and in a medium that, Thornton Wilder said, and I always bastardize it because I'm not good with verbatim, but basically theater is, what he said was, it's the best suited art form for one human being to tell another human being what it is to be a human being. And that requires the multiplicity of human experience. And that to me is what's exciting about theater. And I want all of us to have access to that, Otherwise, it's like we're seeing only a couple colors. We're not seeing the whole spectrum of what's possible.
Well said. Thank you all.
Thank you for the question. All right. Well, I want to thank Dr. Katya Vertis and Quinn O'Connor for the generosity of your time and your demeanor and your experience and your articulate expression of some complicated issues, and also giving us some ideals and some goals to shoot for in our practice as we move forward as professional theater women. So thank you so much. Thank you, audience, for being here, future and current. And that's it. Enjoy the snow, people.